People need to see the progress that they're making. This is a very old human need, and intrapreneurship helps people do that. The large organizations really need to look at discernment and prioritization. Intrapreneurs are really good at navigating or circumnavigating the traditional systems.
I was thinking from your experiences, that's way too long to do that. And is there a better way? Is there a quicker way?
Organizations will say, we want to transform and become an innovation organization or tech-driven, and they're not still willing to change their strategy. Any constraints, they'll get stuck.
Dr. Simone Ahuja is a best-selling author, keynote speaker, and founder of Blood Orange, an innovation and strategy advisory firm specializing in frugal innovation and intrapreneurship. She has worked with global leaders, including 3M, P&G, PepsiCo, and the World Economic Forum. Co-author of the international bestseller Jugaad Innovation, Simone is recognized worldwide for helping teams become more resourceful problem solvers and driving innovation by doing more with less.
Would you say the biggest misconception is actually what the problem people think it is and it not being it at all?
Users can't always tell you what the problem is. That's not really their job. It's your job to figure it out through some of the things they tell you or through some of the things you observe and so on.
What's one innovation trend you're most excited about right now?
What am I most excited about? That's not probably the anticipated type of answer is.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Built for This, Stories of a Maverick, the podcast where we explore the journeys, mindsets, and the ideas that shape transformative leaders. I'm your host, Jenna, and today we are joined by someone who's turning innovation into inclusive leadership practice that empowers everyone, everywhere. Dr. Simone Ahuja is an innovation strategist, best-selling author, the founder of the global advisory firm Blood Orange, where she helps organizations act more like fast, frugal startups, even within large established systems. She co-authored the international bestseller Jugaad Innovation and wrote Disrupt It Yourself, both of which offers hands-on playbooks for sustainable entrepreneurship and practical innovation. Simone's work transcends theory. She advises Fortune 500 companies, contributes to the Harvard Business Review. In our conversation today, we're going to talk about turning scarcity into possibility, building innovation from within, and how anyone, regardless of title or resources, can become an agent for meaningful change. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I would love to kind of start off like I do with everyone to kind of understand a little bit more sort of about you, your background, how you grew up, and sort of how you kind of got into this world you're in now.
So where to start? Well, I grew up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I don't know why, but everyone else asks me if I'm from the Bay Area or maybe New York. Maybe it's the innovation connection, but actually I'm from the plains of the Midwest. We've got a great city here in Minneapolis, so that's a lot of fun. I grew up, my parents are Indian origin, so they both came here for graduate school, and I think that was really informative in terms of how I think about problem solving and how I think about work and how I think about democratization of innovation. I think they really have helped me shape the way I think about that. I would say my academic training is probably different than what one might expect. Originally, I was a dentist. I was trained as a dentist, licensed in the state here, practiced for a couple of years, and quickly realized that wasn't my way forward, and perhaps didn't think that really carefully enough about the fact that I love talking with people, not just at them while the hands are in the mouth. It's a different path, but it was one that was really valuable. And people often will ask me, well, how does that have anything to do with innovation? And, there aren't a ton of similarities, but the one thing I always think about is that innovation is change, really. It's change management, it's change, and that makes most people feel pretty anxious. And if there's one thing we had to learn how to do in dentistry is anxiety management. So I would say that's the piece that stayed with me for a long time.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, kind of coming from, having parents that have immigrated into, a new country. And then generally, my friends like, okay, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be, one of these things when you come here, whether you like it or not. So I'm curious when you're, becoming a dentist isn't like, oh, a couple years of school and you can kind of switch. It's a lot of time spent to be able to, have that title, have that like skill set. What was it like to I imagine, kind of feel a full body, like, this is not where I'm supposed to be, and then let alone take that in, but actually make the decision to do something totally different.
You know what? I think this is the iterative approach to change. I knew actually in the middle of dental school it wasn't for me. I love healthcare. I love science. I love helping people, everything. I love everything about it. I just knew that particular field wasn't going to be for me, but I was already through the hardest part. So I was 6 years in and I finished the last 2 years. So I was dabbling in other things. I practiced full time for maybe a year and then right away went into about 20 hours a week, which is still a very nice living in dentistry. I wasn't looking for the biggest house on the block. I was just looking to sustain myself. And what I would do in my free time then is I would do theater or improv. That's when I started in improv and teaching improv and ultimately documentary filmmaking. And so I think when I stopped dabbling and dove in is when I actually was traveling to India on a just a holiday. And I was being a little too cavalier with my I travel here so much. I can eat whatever I want, whenever I want, even if it's from a shady little stall in the middle of nowhere. And I paid for that with a pretty bad case of typhoid that manifested in the US, in Minnesota, where I don't think they had seen probably a case of typhoid for many years. I think if I'd gotten sick in India, it would have been fine. But here in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, I was in the hospital for 10 days and I was pretty sick. And typhoid is like other tropical diseases where you have these spiky fevers and you hallucinate. And I lost probably like 25 pounds in a very short period of time. So I did not feel good and I did not think I was making a comeback. So when I did, luckily, then I was like, I'm not going to dip my toes in the water anymore. I'm going to start making a very decisive shift out of dentistry and into this other realm that I started to explore, which started with a documentary series in India that went on to PBS. I will tell you very quickly that my parents, you were talking about influence, and I think they were disappointed, but they've also been really supportive, although my dad did tell me he wanted his money back.
I was about to say, there's usually that, like, I did pay for school and that wasn't cheap. So if you're going to make a shift.
Yeah, so we're working on that. What I did do then is once I had made a documentary series for PBS, someone from Best Buy actually contacted me and said, "Hey, I want to learn more about how people problem solve if they don't have a ton of resources. Do you think you can create something?" Because we were essentially creating these video case studies in business. And I wasn't an innovation expert by any means at that time. And I thought, yeah, let's go check it out. So it wasn't just India too. That's where I did most of my research, but looking at other, let's say, emerging markets or cash-strapped entrepreneurs or whatever, whoever is doing better and really problem solving without traditional resources, without necessarily a big title. That's how it all started. And when I went to India to conduct this research for this documentary that Best Buy actually commissioned, I started learning about this concept called Jugaad that you mentioned. My first book is Jugaad Innovation, co-authored with a couple of others. And what was phenomenal to me is that in real time, I was seeing it in action. So I had two teams I was working with. I had very bright, both of them, an American team and an Indian team. And all of them were doing great work. The US team was more linear, like I was. That's how I was trained. And the Indian team, whenever we'd run into a problem, would improvise in real time, and I watched it. So I'll give you a quick example. We were in the Run of Kutch, which is a desert in Gujarat, India, and we were trying to capture a video case study about salt farmers who were getting out of life generational cycles of poverty by creating a system and a pump that would help them earn more money, create salt faster. And so we're in the middle of this desert at that time, especially, and maybe even now, because it was so remote where these salt farmers were, our GPS wasn't on our phones. It was an old man with a long white beard. And it's very scary because when you're in the middle of a desert, it's a lot like being at sea. We couldn't see anything. There were no visual landmarks. And I remember there was a point where we were running out of fuel, we were running out of water, it was getting late, didn't have what we needed, and I was panicking a little bit. And I was like, okay, just saying to my team, like, let's go back. And we're like, no, 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 we're good. And I was like, I think we got to go back. And we had to capture something where we needed to across an area that was kind of craggy and rough. And in order to do that, really, normally you would have something called a steady cam, which steadies the picture so it doesn't look bumpy when you're taking a video or film, or film. And obviously, there was nowhere to get that in the middle of the desert. But my team was like, you know what? It's okay. We can do it. We'll do some Jugaad. And I was like, Jugaad? What? What is it? And I thought, let's just get out of here. But they insisted, and they just sort of fashioned something in real time out of, pillows and PVC pipes and twine. And here they created this kind of makeshift steady cam, and that allowed us to get what we needed. And of course, it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And I think we did capture it. We were able to finish it. That meant we had the time. We had enough time to go on to our next shoot. That meant we weren't over budget. And suddenly I started to see the value of this good enough. It wasn't perfect. And what I realized when we put it all together is it didn't have to be perfect. So that is how I learned about Jugaad. And I kept hearing the word, and I kept seeing different applications, both in informal and even more formal environments. And so that was sort of the genesis of understanding this mindset, because it really starts with a mindset of being adaptive and flexible, which I have to say, Jenna, I think is the most powerful shift that people need to make today to really manage anything. Change is happening fast and furiously.
It is. And then add in a mix of AI kind of going at a rapid pace of how that's going to affect a lot of industries. And I'm kind of curious, you know, so you saw this shift of kind of like a word you didn't know before that meant kind of, I always call like the MacGyver approach, like, I don't know, we're just going to like put these things together and we'll figure out a path forward. Having worked with lots of entrepreneurs in startup mode,
Yes.
that's where I like to be. And like, it's not necessarily a unique problem, but how we get to solve this is going to be really unique to you, your team, your culture, the way you think. And that's kind of the fun part. But there is this like rigidity in a certain type of personality type of like, well, either one, it has to be perfect, or that's not how it's supposed to be done.
That's right.
And so as you start to kind of go in more and I think like unpack more of that mindset and see like real world examples of that everywhere, how did you start to kind of break it down or start to kind of figure out a way to support enabling that mindset and or shifting somebody who would maybe have a tougher time with the good enough?
Oh, yeah. And I work with a lot of engineers too. So in some very large organizations that are engineer driven. So the concept of good enough is not
Doesn't
always.
it's perfectionist. Yeah.
And that's true, like you said, with entrepreneurial organizations too, right? There are always people who are going to say it has to be done this way. That's not the way we do it. That definitely exists in large organizations, not invented here. That's not our approach. Leadership won't like it. In larger organizations and small, I think that one of the easiest ways to address that is to think about where that person's coming from. Sometimes it comes from a risk aversion. So how do you minimize risk, or at least how do you minimize the perception of risk? So sometimes the risk is in standing still and the risk is in being rigid, right? I mean, today that's the real risk. So social proof becomes really important. If another organization is operating in a way that's more improvisational, less resource dependent, and you can share that example, all of a sudden it becomes doable, right? It's like the 4-minute mile. Back before that was cracked, nobody thought anyone could do it. But once somebody did it, a lot of other people did it. So it
Yeah.
wasn't like people suddenly got faster, right? Same thing. So you kind of create the social proof, you reduce the risk, you share those real examples. And then I think the other way is to make it's like an entrepreneur would tell you is make the big problem small. And I think entrepreneurs in particular often will fall in love with the solution, sometimes not the problem, right? This is product market fit. Is that really the right problem we're solving, or is this just a cool solution that we have and we're trying to retrofit it into a problem that's not the biggest problem?
The squirrel tactics. I like to, I'm like, we're squirreling. We're going.
Whirling, exactly, and we're running around the tree. But we really need to get to the heart of the problem. I think those are some ways that we can help address it. I think also doing little tests. I mean, entrepreneurs particularly are really good at this. Large organizations aren't always good at this, but I do think that's another way to help to reduce the, hey, that's not how we do it.
Yeah. And I'm curious, once you obviously had, momentum in terms of what you were doing and the documentary and then the book and everything like that, but from I guess a business perspective, how did founding Blood Orange come to be and kind of creating this innovation firm?
Yes. So it was all very organic. I would say it was webbed, is the way I look at it now, looking back, because it was highly iterative. I didn't always know exactly where I was headed, but I knew generally I was very clear about the idea of helping people understand how to solve problems in a way that was not resource dependent, or it wasn't because you had a big title or like a lab coat or something like that. So what happened is once I conducted this research, the person at Best Buy paired me up with someone who knew more about innovation in emerging markets. And we started working together, and it was fascinating. And we started writing for the Harvard Business Review. That led to someone getting in touch with us saying, this is a really interesting concept. Would you like to write about it? Actually, interject one thing, which is back when we started writing about this in 2008 and 2009, so right before that financial crisis hit the United States, that was back when people would actually type a response to a blog and people would say, "What are you talking about, this Jugaad? And what are we supposed to learn from these third world countries and doing more with less? How do we learn from them, those poor countries?" And people would say things like that. It was shocking. But then the financial crisis came, and I'm telling you, we got more calls about, wait, how do we do that? What is this more with less? Tell us how to be more resourceful. But ultimately, it was a series of events like that. My first keynote was actually a request by Indra Nui, who was the CEO of PepsiCo at that time. And she said she wanted me to come and talk to their 300 senior most leaders at an annual event. At the time, I didn't know that was really a job. Of course, I was
Yeah.
very honored. Of course, they're asking me what's my fee. And I just, the only data point I had was Sheryl Sandberg was their other speaker. So
Right.
I kind of started to figure it out because what was
Yeah.
happening is I was getting a lot of requests to show those films that we had on PBS about resourceful problem solving. But if you're a media maker, even if you have good market knowledge, the truth is you're not going to get paid. And I figured that out very quickly too. But if
Yeah.
you're a market expert who understands problem solving and innovation, well, that starts to become something that people find more value in as a title, even if the information is very similar, right? And so that led to a deeper dive into research, a lot of research on my part, both on the ground research, primary research, secondary research, more books, and so on. So it was pretty organic in that way. What I will say, though, is that I started out with a lot of keynotes and sort of one-day workshops about this idea of Jugaad and thinking more frugally and flexibly. And what I realized in the big organization is it was so hard not just to share that mindset at that time. Now I think it's a lot more common. I think that's one of the biggest changes we've seen in the last few years is that everybody wants to be a resourceful problem solver. Obviously, it's actually pretty evergreen.
Yeah.
But to implement it is another thing because that is where the problems come in, right, Jenna?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're used to solving problems with big budgets, that's how we're trained to solve problems. So, for example, if you are serving an organization, you have a budget, if you don't spend it in this calendar year, what happens to the budget?
It's gone next year. Yeah.
So that's not very good incentive, right?
Yeah.
So that was the genesis of the Blood Orange, and then my second book, Disrupt It Yourself. This is Disrupt It Yourself is let's take all those ideas from Jugaad Innovation and thinking and this mindset and create a playbook for internal entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs in the big companies and let them see exactly how others like them do it. Or if they haven't done it before, this is a roadmap. And I think that's a big takeaway I'd love to share with folks who are listening is innovation, I think, is very often thought of as this random process, and it's not. In fact, it can't be. I was working with one of the world's largest technology organizations recently in their innovation on their innovation team. I mean, they have a huge budget, but even for them, if they don't have any constraints, they'll get stuck because they're going to have too many things to do. There's no direction at all. And then it results in the same overwhelm and burnout that everyone else has.
Yeah.
So those containers, I think, proved to be very valuable. And that's
Yeah.
what the second book was all about. What is the actual process by which we can do this in a large
Mhm.
organization or even a medium or small organization?
I'm curious about, you know, even the statement, helping Fortune 500 companies act like frugal startups always kind of like makes me giggle and smile because I think about it from a recruiting aspect and a lot of reasons why people, will look to leave after a certain amount of time. It's like, okay, I got great training and like, but now it's just so systematic, it's so bureaucratic, and it takes so long to do anything. And I'm bored and I want to go to that startup and I want that energy and I want to be able to move quick and I want to make decisions and see impact. So, I'm so curious about kind of that conversation to go in and like dismantle that in a way where like things can start to move. And at the same time, I think offer people a bit of security of, okay, if I'm going to adapt with this change, I still have a job versus like, we're about to do a bunch of layoffs if we change, the way we've always done things.
A couple of things. One is entrepreneurship is, I love it because it can be more of a discrete event, right? So a lot of organizations will talk about enterprise-wide transformation. And don't tell anyone, but I secretly roll my eyes when I hear that phrase. It's so very difficult. Very few organizations have done that. I worked with one organization that I thought was very successful in doing that. And I think that it was a very clear initiative to be more innovative, more entrepreneurial. It started at the CEO level. There were grassroots entrepreneurs, and there was alignment all the way through. They had real transformation in that organization with Stanley Black and Decker, a longtime client of ours, and they really changed the way they operated
Yeah.
in terms of problem solving, doing better with less, and so on. And also their strategy, though, right? So that's the thing is a lot of times organizations will say we want to transform and become an innovation organization or tech driven or this, and they're not still willing to change their strategy. I'm not going to really have a long talk with them because it's
Yeah.
not really possible. Having said that, what is possible and is valuable, partially from a growth point of view and partially from an employee engagement point of view, is a manager or a leader can say, look, we want to achieve these goals. We have this strategy, we have these pillars, we have these goals, and we're going to use an intrapreneurial approach to get there. That means I'm going to give my teams a process. We're going to follow a certain process that has space within each container. We are going to have more autonomy. I'm not going to babysit you. We're going to learn from each other. We are going to experiment. We're going to learn from whatever doesn't work, and we're going to learn from what does work. And I think not only do you have better results, right? So you have more growth, you have more interesting, unique, value added innovation for sure. But then you also have more engaged teams who are less likely to leave because they feel valued. I mean, one thing I learned at a very large health insurance organization is that they wanted to solve the world's health problems. It's a beautiful goal. It's a beautiful mission rather, and it's so, can get at your heart for a minute until you're in it and you can't see any of that progress day to day. People need to see the progress that they're making. This is a very old human need, and entrepreneurship is helps people do that. It helps them feel like they're making progress, it helps them feel valued, it helps them see the advancement that's happening so that they feel more engaged and so they don't get as burnt out either.
And it's interesting. It kind of makes me think about when I was getting my change management certification. I remember one of the like stats right away the teachers led with is like 70% of all change management initiatives fail. And I start howling and I was like, okay, look at us go. And then you start to break it down and we had a bunch of different people with a bunch of different work experiences and me going, and I laughed. I'm like, of course, have you been in like a high growth startup, like a pivot that, founder will say yes. But the time that it takes to do things effectively, whether you make it as ambitious from a timeline perspective as you can, will never be fast enough. And so it just falls off the wayside. You'll get maybe half of it done or a quarter of it done. And then it's like, nope, we got to go this way, drop everything. I don't want to focus. We're taking too much time. And I was thinking, from your experiences, has that come up a lot for you in terms of like, oh yeah, we would love that, but that's way too long to do that. And is there a better way? Is there a quicker way?
It does come up. It does come up. And I think it has to do, it's a little different in a large organization. Sometimes it's too fast. It's too different for us to do things that way. I think that, the large organizations really need to look at discernment and prioritization. I think that is a big part of what helps them speed up because a lot of their processes are in place. Having said that, entrepreneurs are really good at navigating or circumnavigating the traditional systems. That is a part of what we teach people. It's not that you're going off the rails or you're not, you're really moving towards the greater good. We like
Yeah.
to say, Navy SEAL, not pirate, right?
Mhm.
So you're not trying to break glass, but you're trying to do things in a different way. So I think for large organizations, it's very much about people having alignment, having clarity about priorities, and reducing the amount of things that they're working on and having a process and support so that they can go faster.
Yeah.
In a smaller, more entrepreneurial organization, I do understand that tension around speed and then, oh, we're giving up. Okay, that didn't get finished. We're moving on to the next thing. I
Yeah.
think discernment and prioritization is still relevant to the startup, right? Because
Yeah.
that can happen, that kind of creep can happen in an entrepreneurial organization too.
For sure. And then, obviously from an inclusion perspective and, access and especially large organizations, it felt like for a while that was a big pivot of, how can we create leadership teams and hiring processes so we're not like you went to this school, you're friends with this person, or we all look the same and have the same backgrounds and therefore, this must be great. No, it's not. So how do you kind of, weed that in from like a strategy perspective and have those conversations in those larger, generally more kind of complex hierarchy organizations?
You have to work with the right kind of leader. I think there are leaders who will say, we want to do this. A CEO will say, look, we have to become more innovative. It is the best and most proven path to growth. That's a fact. Especially growth that's sustainable and it's more exponential. And then all of a sudden you get a bunch of calls from the next layer saying, okay, we want to be more innovative. And then we have a conversation and they don't want to change their metrics. They don't want to look at what it is that works. They don't want to really give people the autonomy that they'll need to operate in the way that an intrapreneur does or an internal innovator does. And I think very often that is a reflection of two things. So one is it's how they feel about themselves. So if they don't trust themselves, they're going to be less likely to trust their teams, even if and perhaps especially if they're their own hires. So that's something that's become very clear to me over time. The second is not really understanding that innovation is a part of a strategy, and you have to have a well articulated innovation strategy, and that strategy has to roll right up into your business strategy. And if it doesn't, and people can't see that, then you're going to have a big problem because it's going
Yeah.
to feel like a big shiny disco ball kind of a stitch where everybody's like, oh, right, we're going to do this today. Nobody's going to fall into in line with that. And I think, the other thing we think about is we know that when we have more diverse perspectives, we're going to have better outcomes and better solutions, especially when it comes to innovation, especially when that's coupled with psychological safety.
Yeah. And I'm curious, from your background with improv and then storytelling through the documentary, how is that sort of cascaded into your approach with clients or part of kind of your frameworks?
One thing I do now, and I always love to think about this, what do I do differently now than I did 15 years ago? Because that really, it's the delta. So it's the thing that I had no clue about then that was actually really important. And one of them is the way we talk to people. So a lot of people will talk about it from a storytelling perspective. I think that's very important. And I often will emphasize an influence perspective. So for example, I'm sure I often will coach entrepreneurs as well as intrapreneurs. We'll listen to pitches and we get a lot of, hey, I've got this great idea. Let me tell you why I think it's so cool. As opposed to, I know that you're interested in advancing healthcare in, on the West Coast from, Northern California to Southern California. And this idea I have is actually going to really help with that. Would you like to hear more? Yes, I would, right?
So what's in it for you? Yeah.
Which is no different than the innovation framework we love to use that Clay Christensen talked about forever, which is called jobs to be done. What is the job you're doing? And it's all about needs. So, in innovation, a lot of times we're talking about something called a functional need. So, what do you need to do? Like if it's a car, you might say, I need to get from point A to point B. But if you think about the other big two needs we talked about, there's an emotional need, which is how do you need to feel? And you might eventually, if you're asking open-ended questions and you're observing, you might say, well, I need to feel safe. I need to feel confident that my car will get from here to here safely while my kids are in the car after I pick them up from school. And then there's a third need, which is the social need. And it's how do you want to be seen and heard? How do you want to be perceived? And a lot of times it's about competence. So, for example, if you're talking with a leader who, I was working with a group of UX folks in a very large technology firm, and they are so bright and talented and creative and innovative, but they were complaining that they didn't unlock a lot of funding. And I asked them to tell me, well, how are you talking about it? And they'll say, well, I explained to them that this user interface isn't easy to navigate because of this. And I show them, but they still don't get it. And it's like, well, what are they on the hook for? In the end, they're on the hook for top line growth. So do we want to talk about how your great idea and that true story you're telling is going to actually impact top line growth? 100%. So that's the shift. That's the empathy piece of innovation. And it's that sort of jobs to be done framework, essentially, in innovation that applies right back to storytelling, which is a part of influence. Because if you can't tell a good story in a way that someone else wants to receive it or can hear it, or it makes sense to them, or it's relevant to them, then you're not going to get anywhere.
And from, your advisory work to kind of speaking in workshops, sort of, how have you created these to sort of pull organizations in and to kind of transform them from that innovation and or sort of culture perspective?
Well, I think there are different layers. Usually I'll come in through somebody's read my book, or maybe an article, and I'll say, hey, can you come in and talk to either our team, it'll be at an annual event like a keynote. But a lot of times it'll be a strategy session. So it'll be a strategy session for mid-level or senior level folks, and helping them really rethink their strategy. How do they rethink innovation, and then thinking about how do they lead better problem solving. And increasingly, I just talk about better problem solving, because the truth is the principles are similar, not the same, but they are similar. I mean, certainly, if we're talking about big disruptive innovation, they might be different. That's not where most organizations are headed yet. I think AI is going to change that. But then I think what's really, really important is after that keynote happens is you got to have some application so that people can really understand what it feels like. So I think the most effective thing I've seen is that we have a sprint. It's usually 8 to 12 weeks. It's with people who are actually executing in real time, not people who are talking about it. And they have a problem that they come with, and we ask them to make their big problem small. Then we define, is this really a problem? We go through that whole process. Is this really a problem? They usually will adjust, because they'll find out, oh, actually, that wasn't exactly the problem. The real pain point is this. Like, for example, we were working with one media organization in the same way. We had a 12-week sprint, and we had 25 of their people going through this scenario. And one of the people, there was a lot of attrition in the technicians who would go out and fix, let's say, your cable or something else that allow you to get media into your home. And they said, well, we aren't paying them enough. And so then we thought, really, is this really correct? And when they dove into it using this framework and thinking about needs in a different way, what they found out is that they were having a lot of attrition because you had to go through so much gymnastics to change your schedule, even if it was an apples to apples switch with a peer. But if you want to go to your kid's soccer game, you had to speak to a leader. You had to fill out a form. You had to do so many things just to do something very simple and fundamental. People did not feel respected. So the issue wasn't about payment. It was about respect, feeling valued, feeling like you're an adult who has some autonomy. I mean, that is pretty amazing. So then we keep going through the process. We think about what the solutions are. We muff them up. So in that case, there became a streamlined, simplified process for making an apples to apples switch that was automatic. It was almost free to make. It was very low cost solution. It wasn't very fancy, but it was easy and it wasn't disruptive and it was in alignment with the company policies overall. And so suddenly you have the right problem being solved with a great fix that did actually reduce attrition in real time in 12 weeks. So I think those are the things that I find really valuable for teams. Now, if somebody really wants to talk about enterprise-wide transformation, then show me the strategy.
Yeah.
Then we're going to go into a deep dive about strategy. And then we're going to go into a conversation about governance. And then we're going to talk about metrics. I want you to tell me what really moves people, right?
Yeah.
If you were talking about change and change management, and 70% of these things don't stick. And what I find is that when people say, hey, we want to make this change, and we want to be, culture of innovation and learning, and we want to, they talk about all these things. And then I ask them to say, well, that is a change initiative. Tell me what really moves things here. That's one. So is it really for some organizations, it is financial rewards or compensation. For a lot of them, it's simple. It's recognition. I mean, it could be as simple as that. It could be exposure. It could be development. The other thing I asked them is, what is it that's worked in the past? So there was one leader I worked with who we had to have this conversation about, we can do this, but we really have to think about what works here. And I said, tell me about the last change management effort that really worked, that you feel good about. And he said, we had to change an educational component. We had to change the way we took in information around a specific topic in this large company. And I said, why did it stick? And he said, well, we had some early messaging. We gave people specific training. We had multiple touch points that were reinforced over time. We attached some light metrics to it. I was like, there we go. So that's the same thing here. So if that's what has to happen, what doesn't work is leadership saying, hey, we have to become more innovative. And people saying, yeah, we want to be more innovative. And then nothing happens in the middle. What I also find, though, in terms of change management, making it stick, is this is probably the biggest tension, Jenna, that I observe is there's this chasm between what leadership says and what people do. But here's the thing. So sometimes leaders don't know much about innovation. Sometimes they don't really know how to do it. A lot of times, though, most of the time, there's very few leaders who say, I don't want to help.
Yeah.
Mostly they want to help, but what their challenge is they have too much on their plate already. They are responsible for, depending on what level, maybe it's a P&L. I'm already on the hook for all this. I can't help people figure this out, especially if it's something we're doing in a new and different way.
Yeah, I don't have time.
I'm drowning here, right? On this side, on the intrapreneur side, sometimes it's I don't have support. Sometimes it's people say that we have support, but actually I've seen in real time that if people go off the rails a little bit, they actually are penalized for it. And I've seen this too in practice. It's really unfortunate. Most of the time, it's about a practice and a process. What I've learned over the years too is there is no shortage of great ideas that could lead to innovation, almost ever. It's usually about how do we execute it. So how do we articulate the problem in a way that is the real problem? How do we make the big problem small? And then how do we actually execute it step by step? Again, you've got these different containers and you've got space within each to move, but you have to have that process. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming. So that's why I love those 8 to 12 week sprints. Because when people do it with their own real business problem that they are on the hook for, A, it doesn't feel like wasted time. B, they see what the impact is in action and they learn from the cohort too.
And would you say the biggest misconception is actually what the problem people think it is and it not being it at all?
Yeah, I do think that's right. That's really true. And I think my partner is an engineer and we talk about this for years. I think he and I are starting to see each other a little bit more that way. But I remember earlier on telling him that, I'd work in these very renowned engineering organizations saying they're not solving the right problem. He's like, what do you mean? That's how can that be? I was like, because they're making it up in the lab. They're not talking to anybody. And sometimes users can't always tell you what the problem is. That's not really their job. It's your job to figure it out through some of the things they tell you or through some of the things you observe and so on. But I do think that is core problem is not, I think that's probably the biggest, not solving the right problem.
And I know you mentioned, you know, very rarely is there not a group of people that couldn't kind of get together and create ideas and figure out a way to solve a problem. What would what would be your advice for either teams or people who are feeling stuck and that, innovation is just out of reach? Like, we're just not able to move. We're not as like nimble as we would need to be in comparison to X competitor or, whatever's going on. And they're just kind of in that standstill place.
I think the first thing is to not lose hope. Yeah, right away. I think there's a point where people have to reconsider where they are. But I think the first thing is to find your people. So there are people like you in your organization, most likely, especially if you're in a larger organization. You gotta find those people, and if you can find someone in that, who's a leader that was like you, even better, because they can then, mentor you. I think, the second thing is to do a tiny test. Take something really micro and do a tiny test by yourself. So, for example, if you're working at a consumer goods company and you're saying, "Hey, new parents really want a safer way to wrap their babies, up when they're sleeping so they don't wake themselves up and Velcro isn't too loud." It's actually a pretty real problem. If you know that's a problem and that's a group that your organization wants to serve, do the test. Interview a few people, talk to a few people, take a few videos, gather the data. The more you can gather even a little bit of real data, it doesn't sound like your opinion. You can start to mitigate that, "Oh, that sounds great, but it's not really a problem." And I think the third thing is to, when you're doing that, demonstrate that you have a process. I'll share this with you too, Jenna. We have a worksheet, it's like a Mad Lib called Recontracting. And I actually developed this after talking with a manager who really wanted to get more involved in innovation, but it wasn't in her role. And so she told me how she was able to become more of an innovator with her leader. And I've heard this from others as well. So I sort of synthesized it, took my own research and put it together. And it's kind of like a Mad Lib. This is the problem I observed. This is why I care about it. This is why it matters to the organization. Here's how to advance, our shared goals. This is the first step that I'll take. I need your help in just this one small way, right? I don't need you to hold my hand or do this big, massive lift or
Yeah.
need a whole bunch of budget, but I am going to enroll you a little tiny bit so that A, you feel good about having a little tiny role in it, and because it's going to help me advance.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to share with you what I learned in this specific way at these intervals. And suddenly you've got a process and something that's not a big heavy lift, but demonstrates that you're strategic, that you're thoughtful, that you have a process, that you really care, that you're thinking about what matters to the entire organization, not just your personal interests, and especially to your customer or your end user. I think it's really powerful. So I will share that with you.
Yeah, no, I love that worksheet. Often get, especially working within, that high growth mode and teams are building quickly or they've kind of plateaued for a little bit. And sometimes then that separation from the founder gets a little bit bigger because now the team's bigger. So there's a miss of like having that person's kind of spotlight on them and being around that energy, but then also a little bit more for whatever reason, sometimes of a fear to now approach and get that permission to like change or see things differently. And depending on the day, if it's high emotion, I'm like, well, you can't walk in there complaining and venting about the problem to said founder. That's not going to go over well. So take a breath, like calm down. What is the problem that's actually the problem? How do you want to approach it? Where's like as much data as you can pull because they're going to want to fact check you on it and like start to build that out. So I think people having a framework that they can go to and start to really understand how to put together everything and then approach, their manager, their leader, or the founder, whatever that might be, would just give people so much more hope, as you mentioned, to kind of engage back into the organization if they're feeling kind of like disconnected.
100%, 100%. And thinking about that influence piece, what is it that they care about? Let me tell you, I want to alert you of this change that's happened that's going to make us rethink the problem that we're solving here. I mean, I would want to hear that as opposed to, oh, this isn't, working out the way I thought it would.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love your approach in this style in which you kind of look at things and how you interact and come from that really like practical perspective. But also, I like to always use the acronym, like the KISS acronym, like keep it simple, stupid. Like, let's not make this way more complicated. And my phrase is always, if I see a document that is just super complicated, I'm just like, this makes my face hurt. And I was like, I actually can't like, there's got to be a simpler way. Like,
Yeah. And I think right now there literally has to be. There has to be a simpler way because everyone feels like that about most things. So, this idea of breaking things into small pieces, of creating simplicity where there was complexity, of solving the right problem that has the greatest impact instead of chasing down 20 ideas that actually have little to no impact. These are the ways that we can add more value, create more growth, and not get burnt out. So I think that's right. But none of us want our face to hurt.
I know. And solving the right problem, priority number one is the big push. And so I would kind of love to round out our time just with some rapid fire questions to close everything out. So question number one, what's one innovation trend you're most excited about right now?
I mean, I'm just excited that this idea of constraint-driven innovation or constraint-led design, it's not new, but it's gaining a lot of traction. Constraints as a lever for innovation is gaining a ton of traction right now because I think people see that it's not just a shiny thing in an article, it actually works. So that for me is really huge. I think, of course, AI is a massive enabler of constraint-driven innovation. Even years ago when I researched for our first book, Jugaad Innovation, and we were talking about dumb phones and things like that. And tech is getting less expensive and it is going to allow us to do better with less as long as we have discernment, as long as we know what to go chasing down, because part of constraint driven innovation is just staying in the clear buckets. The second thing I'll share, Jenna, about what am I most excited about that's not probably the anticipated type of answer is space. I work with a lot of very senior leaders. I've had several requests recently for opportunities to get together to create space
Mm,
because they simply don't have time to think anymore.
right.
So that is the way that you're going to actually drive more innovation than anything else, because if you're not thinking clearly and you're only fighting fires.
Yeah, that's my favorite question to ask founders. I'm like, well, how many hours or where's the chunk in your week in terms of your schedule where you just get to think? There's nothing else and you just think. And their face just drops like there's nothing. I'm just scheduled back to back nonstop. It never ends. I'm like, so how can you be present in really what's going on if you're constantly just like simple problem to solve, but yet very complicated for a lot of people to like
100%.
let go of like, I don't need to be doing this anymore. This is not what I need to be spending my time on.
100%.
Love it. What is a tool, an app, and habit that you kind of swear by that allows you to sort of keep your creative energy flowing?
For me, it's yoga
Mm.
and sweat. Like I sweat
Yeah.
or no matter what happens. I was saying that to this yoga teacher this morning. About the challenge. Sometimes I usually go at 6 a.m. So it means you have to get up, earlier and get your stuff together. And I like to have something, drink. But you never walk out of there going, I wish I didn't do that.
You never regret the workout you didn't have. Like,
And that just keeps me kind of grounded. It keeps me sane. I do feel like my body and my mind is freed up afterwards.
super important. Who's a leader or innovator, past or present, you'd love to have dinner with and why?
Gandhi. I think of Gandhi as an innovator and this idea of nonviolence and how you achieve huge shifts in a way that's totally unanticipated in a war, right? In a war situation. How do you, or when you're trying to break a country in half, for example. So
Yeah.
I would love to have dinner with him.
Awesome. What's the most unexpected place or experience that sparked an idea for you?
Well, it's not a great habit, but once in a while I like to have a glass of wine, and I would say
Yeah.
it's just the
Let go a little bit, relax.
and I think what it is in that moment, if you're having space, sometimes, we had a family reunion in Europe this summer. My family went to Paris ahead of that. And I will tell you, there were some really big ideas in my mind at the time. And it was because I hadn't had a lot of space probably. And maybe it just was,
Yeah.
either there was just a lot of wine or maybe it just happens that it was while I was having dinner a glass of wine, these ideas would come forward. I think it comes back to that idea of taking time to connect with people and to create space.
Well, and play is such a big piece. I watched a documentary. I can't remember what type of monkey it was, but there's a tree that produced grapes and they would end up eating the grapes, but they would get drunk and then they would start playing. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense now of why people love wine. I was like, it just like lets go and they start to play and like laugh and like let go of everything else. And then no wonder that you're like, oh my goodness, I can solve that problem now.
Actually, I think that's a really good analogy because I think we need to play more. I emphasize a lot in my work that we need to have more fun. I remember again, like, what is the delta? I used to talk about it kind of quietly. It was a little improv. I would do or talk about some principles, 10 plus years ago. And now I'm like, you have to have more fun. Not all the time. It's not going to
Yeah.
be that way all the time, but you have to have trust. You have to have connection. You want to have more fun because everybody's going to feel better and get more done when you're having fun, when you're eating those grapes.
Yeah. Life's too short to be stressed, all the time. And final question, in your own words, define what built for this means to you.
Built for this means knowing what you stand for and how to get there.
I love it. I appreciate you taking time and filling me in on your processes and everything that's kind of, how you got to where you are. I love it. In terms of kind of how people, obviously you do keynotes, workshops, your team's working with companies. If somebody listening is really curious about how to learn more, obviously, one piece is your books, but how is the best way to sort of connect in with you and your team if they're interested in working with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way is to drop a note on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, or you can go to our website, which is simoneahuja.com. So SimoneAhuja.com, and get in touch with us. I'd be happy to have a chat if folks have questions. I always love talking to people who are trying to figure out better ways to be resourceful problem solvers.
I love it. Well, I appreciate it. And I look forward to staying connected.
Thank you, Jenna. Me too.